Snow drifted in wide, silent sheets across the Montana plains, blanketing the broken fences and lonely barns in a world of white. Daniel Carter, a rancher in his late 30s, rode his chestnut mare through the storm with the steady rhythm of a man used to solitude. His ranch sat miles from the nearest town, a quiet place where only the wind spoke, and even that spoke in whispers. He had once dreamed of filling it with laughter, with the sound of children running through the snow, but those dreams had frozen years ago, when the doctor told him his wife had died barren, and he, too, could never father a child. The ranch became his prison of memories. But that morning, as the storm thickened and the sky turned a pale gray, Daniel spotted something that didn't belong in the vast whiteness. A small, trembling figure beside a half-frozen wagon stuck in the drift. Curiosity and instinct pulled him closer. When he reached the wreck, he saw a girl thin, shivering, her hands raw and blue from cold trying to free a mule trapped in the snow. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her dress was torn, her hair tangled beneath a wool scarf, and her eyes carried a look Daniel had seen only once before in the mirror, years after losing everything. She was terrified, but there was something fierce in her, too, something that refused to die. "Hey there," Daniel called gently, sliding from his saddle, careful not to spook her. "You'll freeze out here." The girl froze mid-motion, clutching the rope tied around the mule. "Don't come near me," she rasped, her voice cracked and hoarse. "I ain't going back. I'd rather die here than go back." Daniel frowned. "Go back where?" She hesitated, eyes darting between him and the horse. Her breath came in ragged clouds. "To the mine camp," she whispered finally. "They made me work, said I owed them for my keep. But they lied. I never owed them nothin'." The words hit him like a hammer. Child labor, runaway. He'd heard of such things, orphans taken in by traders or miners, promised shelter but given chains instead. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're safe now," he said quietly, unbuttoning his coat and draping it over her shoulders. She flinched at first but didn't pull away when she felt the warmth. "Name's Daniel Carter. My ranch is just a few miles east. You'll come with me." "I can't," she murmured, looking down. "They'll come for me. Then they'll have to ride through hell to find you," Daniel said simply, with a tone that left no room for doubt. He lifted her onto his horse and wrapped his arms around her to steady her against the wind. The snow thickened, stinging their faces as they rode. She didn't speak again, but after a long while her head rested lightly against his shoulder. When they finally reached his ranch, she was half asleep, her lips pale, her body trembling uncontrollably. Daniel carried her inside, laid her near the fire, and covered her with a wool blanket. For a long moment he stood over her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest dot in the flickering light. Her face softened. She looked fragile, too young to have suffered so much, yet strong in a way that stirred something inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in years, hope. Not the wild kind that burns fast and dies, but the quiet kind that sneaks up on a man when he least expects it. He didn't know who she was or what trouble might follow her. But one thing was certain: the moment Daniel Carter found her in the snow, his lonely world had shifted forever. Outside, the storm howled against the window, but inside the cabin, warmth began to return, not just to the girl's body, but to Daniel's frozen heart. When dawn crept over the snow-blanketed valley, the world outside Daniel Carter's cabin looked like a painting carved from silence. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft amber light over the wooden floor. Daniel stirred from his chair, having fallen asleep beside the fireplace with his coat still on. His bones ached from the cold ride, but his first thought wasn't of himself. It was of the girl lying on the cot near the stove. He rose quietly, poured a cup of hot water, and checked on her. She was awake, though barely. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking on him with the kind of wariness that only a child who had known too much fear could have. "Morning," Daniel said gently. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here." She tried to sit up, but the effort brought a sharp gasp of pain. "Where am I?" "My ranch," he replied, pulling another blanket over her. "You collapsed out in the snow. If I hadn't come along, you'd have frozen by nightfall." She blinked slowly, studying him with suspicion and confusion. "Why'd you help me?" Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure himself. Maybe because she reminded him of something he'd lost long ago, innocence, maybe, or the simple urge to protect someone. "Because no one deserves to die out there," he said finally. "You got a name?" Her lips trembled before she spoke. "Lila. Pretty name," Daniel said softly, though she turned away as if ashamed of it. "You got any family, Lila?" She shook her head, eyes glistening. "My ma died when I was little. A man took me to the mining camp, said he'd find me work, but he lied. I was just a hand to scrub floors and haul buckets. When I ran, they said they'd drag me back and make me pay." Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. He'd seen cruelty in men before, but hearing it from her mouth stirred something fierce inside him, a protective rage he hadn't felt in years. "You ain't going back," he said firmly. "You stay here until we figure something better." For the first time, she met his gaze directly. Her eyes were a deep hazel, like sunlit honey through smoke. "You do that for me? You don't even know me." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's when help matters most." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was fragile, like snow landing softly on still water. Daniel made her oatmeal sweetened with a spoon of molasses, and though she ate in small bites, she finished every spoonful. When she thanked him, her voice was barely above a whisper. Over the next few days, as the storm raged outside, Lila began to heal. She helped him with small chores around the cabin, drying wood by the stove, cleaning the old pans, brushing down the mire in the barn when her strength returned. Each day she spoke a little more. Daniel noticed how she'd hum softly while sweeping, or pause to stare out the window at the falling snow, lost in thoughts she didn't share. He didn't push. He'd learned long ago that some wounds can't be rushed. They have to melt like ice, slow and gentle. At night, when the wind howled and the fire flickered low, he'd sometimes hear her crying softly in the next room. He never intruded, just left an extra blanket by her door before turning in. He told himself he was helping her because it was right, because no decent man could leave a girl to freeze, but deep down, a small part of him began to feel something else, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. One morning, after days of silence from the storm, sunlight broke across the snowfields like gold. Lila stepped outside wrapped in his old coat, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, smiling for the first time since he'd met her. The smile caught Daniel off guard. It was small and shy, but it reached her eyes and thawed something inside him. "Yeah," he said, staring at her longer than he should have. "It is." That day they worked side by side repairing a fence buried in snowdrifts. Layla's laughter, though rare, filled the empty fields like music. And when dusk came and the sky turned violet, Daniel realized he no longer felt alone. The house, once haunted by silence, now carried a living heartbeat. He didn't know what the future held, only that fate had brought this girl to his doorstep for a reason. And though she didn't know it yet, Daniel Carter's heart, once frozen by loss, had begun to stir again like spring waiting beneath the snow. The peace of winter didn't last. It rarely did in the wild country. For weeks, the snow lay quiet across the Carter ranch, glinting under soft morning light while smoke rose from the cabin chimney. Daniel and Lila fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural, almost like family. She helped feed the horses, cooked simple meals, and even laughed sometimes, an unguarded, ringing laugh that filled the cold air like birdsong. But beneath that laughter, Daniel could sense something restless. Lila would often glance toward the horizon, her smile fading, as though afraid the world beyond the snow might remember her. One morning, when Daniel rode into town for supplies, he noticed two strangers at the saloon, a pair of rough-looking men with miners' coats dusted in ice and soot. Their boots were worn, their eyes mean. He felt them watching him as he loaded flour and sugar into his wagon. When he passed by, one of them muttered, "Ain't that Carter? Heard he's got a young one hid up at his place." The words froze him where he stood. His heart pounded hard enough that he felt it in his throat. He didn't turn to face them, just climbed onto the wagon and drove out of town, snow crunching under the wheels. The wind bit his face all the way home. By the time he reached the ranch, evening had fallen and the sky was burning orange behind the pines. Lila was out by the corral, brushing the mare's coat. She smiled when she saw him, but the fear in his chest wouldn't let him smile back. "Lila," he said, stepping closer, voice low. "You need to tell me something. Did anyone follow you from that mine camp?" Her hands froze mid-brush. She didn't answer for a long time. Then, softly, "Maybe. The foreman, he said he'd find me no matter where I ran." Daniel's jaw tightened. They might already be looking. Two men in town, miners. One of them knew your name. The color drained from her face. I can't go back there. You don't understand what they do. Her voice broke. "Please, Daniel. Don't let them take me." He stepped forward and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "No one's taking you anywhere. I promise." That night, he barred the door and kept his rifle by the window. Snow fell thick and fast again, muffling the world outside. Lila didn't sleep. He could hear her pacing in the next room, whispering prayers beneath her breath. At dawn, the ranch lay buried beneath another foot of snow. Daniel went out to check the fences, but halfway across the field he spotted something in the distance, hoof prints, half covered by the storm, leading straight toward his land. He rushed back to the cabin. "They're here," he said quietly, his voice sharp as frost. Lila's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like the terrified girl he'd found weeks ago in the snow. "Go hide in the cellar," he ordered. "And don't come out till I say." She hesitated. "Daniel, now, Lila." She obeyed, vanishing down the narrow steps as he pulled the trapdoor shut and threw a rug over it. Moments later, the sound of horses broke through the still air, two riders approaching slowly through the snow. Daniel waited by the window until they came into view. It was the same pair from town, their faces red from cold, eyes hard and greedy. The taller one called out, "Mornin', Carter. We're looking for a runaway girl. Word is she's been hiding out here. You seen her?" Daniel stepped outside, shotgun resting across his arm. "You're trespassing. Turn around." The man sneered. "We got legal claim on her. She's property of the mining company. She ain't property of nobody." Daniel snapped, his voice rising, sharp as the wind. The men exchanged a look, their smirks darkening. "Careful, rancher. Harboring a runaway can get a man shot." Daniel took a step forward. "Then I guess you better start shooting." The air tensed. Snowflakes drifted between them, slow and silent. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the men cursed under their breath, spat on the ground, and turned their horses back toward the hills. Daniel didn't lower his shotgun until they were gone from sight. When he finally opened the trapdoor, Layla was crouched below, trembling. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she climbed up and threw her arms around him. For a moment, Daniel froze, but then he let himself hold her, his hand resting on the back of her head as she cried into his chest. "They won't come back," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure. "You're safe, Lila, I swear it." For the rest of that day, she followed him around the ranch, afraid to be out of sight. They didn't talk much, but something between them had changed. The fear had drawn them closer, bound by unspoken trust. When night came, Daniel sat by the fire, and she sat beside him, wrapped in his old wool coat. "You could have gotten yourself killed," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Worth it." Lila turned her face toward the fire, her eyes glistening with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. And as the flames danced against the window, Daniel realized his heart had crossed a line he hadn't meant to. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was falling for her, quietly and completely, like snow falling through still air. Winter began to soften its grip on the valley. The snow that had once buried the fences now melted into glittering rivulets, and the air smelled faintly of wet pine and thawing earth. For the first time in months, Daniel Carter felt the weight of solitude lift from his shoulders. Lila's laughter had returned to the ranch like sunlight breaking through long clouds, and her presence filled every empty space that once echoed with silence. She'd grown stronger, her cheeks full again, her steps light, and though she still carried shadows in her eyes, she no longer flinched when the wind howled against the walls. Together they rebuilt what the winter had taken. Daniel taught her to mend saddles and shoe a horse, while she showed him how to bake bread from the simplest ingredients. He'd watch her knead dough by the stove, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, humming softly to herself. And something inside him would ache not with pain, but with a strange, tender longing he hadn't felt since his wife died years ago. It frightened him at first, how easily she'd taken root in his heart. He told himself it was only gratitude, only the need for companionship after years of being alone. But every time she smiled up at him, or brushed a strand of hair from her face with flour-dusted fingers, he knew it was something deeper. One afternoon, as they rode along the ridge above the frozen creek, Lila looked out across the wide, thawing land. "I never thought I'd get to see spring again," she said softly. "Back there, at the mine, every day felt the same, gray, cold, like time didn't move." Daniel turned in the saddle, watching her hair catch the breeze. "You'll see plenty of springs now. You're free of all that." She smiled faintly. "Because of you." He looked away, embarrassed. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said quietly. "Not anyone." The words hung between them, carried by the wind. He didn't answer, just touched the brim of his hat and urged his horse forward. But that night, when he lay awake listening to the sound of her soft breathing from the next room, those words wouldn't leave him. A week later, when they returned from town, Daniel noticed how folks had begun to whisper curious glances, knowing smirks. A rancher and a girl living alone out in the hills. He ignored them, but Lila had seen the looks too. That evening, as they fed the horses, she spoke softly without turning. "People in town? They think it's wrong. Me stayin' here." Daniel hesitated, tightening the bridle strap. "Let them think what they want. You got nowhere else to go, and I ain't sending you back to that life." She faced him then, her eyes shimmering in the soft glow of lantern light. "It's not that I want to leave, Daniel. It's that I don't want to keep running from whispers. I want to earn my place here." He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You already have." The look that passed between them then said more than words could. For months he had fought against what his heart already knew. She wasn't the broken child he'd rescued anymore. She was a woman now, strong and kind, with a spirit that lit his world. But even so, guilt tugged at him. He was older, worn by years and loss. She deserved someone young, someone untouched by sorrow. Yet when her eyes met his, he saw no hesitation, only trust. That night, as the wind howled outside, Daniel sat by the fire and found her sitting beside him again. the same way she had that night months ago when she was still frightened and fragile. Only now there was a quiet courage in her eyes. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice barely above the crackling fire. "You saved my life, but you gave me more than that. You gave me a home." He swallowed hard. "Lila," she reached for his hand. Her fingers were warm, slender, trembling slightly. "I know what you're thinking," she whispered, "that I'm too young, that people will talk. But I don't care about them. I only care about you." He looked at her then, truly looked at the strength she'd found, the woman she'd become. And in that moment, all the walls he'd built over the years fell away. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissed it gently, and whispered, "You deserve a better man, Lila." Her smile was small, but sure. "Maybe, but the heart don't choose by reason." They sat there for a long while, hands intertwined, the fire's light dancing across their faces. Outside, snow melted from the eaves, dripping steadily like time finally moving again. By the time dawn broke, neither of them had spoken another word, but both knew something had changed. Love had crept in quietly, like spring seeping through the frost, and it wasn't going to fade. Over the next weeks, they lived as though the world had granted them a second chance. Daniel built a new corral, and Lila planted wildflowers along the fence line. They rode together every morning, their laughter echoing across the hills. The fear and loneliness that had once haunted them were replaced by warmth, by belonging. And though Daniel still wrestled with the thought of what people might say, he couldn't deny what his heart told him each time he looked at her, that she was meant to be here. Not as a stray he'd rescued, but as the woman who'd rescued him in return. By the time the next winter rolled around, the Carter Ranch no longer felt like a place of ghosts. It was still modest old fences, weathered boards, a roof that creaked when the wind howled, but there was life now. Lila had turned 19 that fall, and Daniel had stopped marking the years between them. Out here, time moved differently. The land didn't care for numbers, only for hearts that endured. Together, they had built something that could not be measured: trust, warmth, and a kind of love that grew not from passion alone, but from shared survival. The first snow came early that year. Lila stood on the porch at dawn, watching it fall soft and steady across the fields. Daniel joined her, wrapping a worn blanket over her shoulders. "Looks like we're in for another hard winter," he said, his voice deep and calm. She smiled faintly. "Then we'll face it like the last one together." That simple word "together" was enough to make his chest tighten with gratitude. For a man who had once believed his life was over, who had buried love beneath frozen soil, Daniel now found himself alive in ways he'd forgotten possible. Lila didn't try to fix him. She didn't ask for promises he couldn't give. She just was steady, kind, and stubbornly hopeful. Like the wildflowers she'd planted that spring that somehow survived the frost. They never spoke much about marriage. The nearest preacher came through town once every few months, and neither of them felt the need to prove what already existed. To the world, perhaps, they were an odd pair, the barren rancher and the girl he'd once rescued, but to themselves, they were something simpler and truer. Two souls who had found home in one another. That winter tested them again. The storms were worse than the last, and feed ran low. Daniel grew sick one week with fever, and Lila tended to him day and night, her small hands wiping his brow, her voice soft in the dim lamplight. "You're not leaving me," she'd whisper whenever he drifted in and out of sleep. "You hear me? You promised." He recovered slowly, weak but alive, and every time he opened his eyes, she was there, his anchor in the storm. When he was strong enough to stand again, he caught her outside, trying to fix the chicken coop with frostbitten fingers. He walked up behind her, wrapped her hands in his, and said quietly, "I'd forgotten what it feels like to be needed." She turned to face him, her eyes bright despite the cold. You didn't just save me, Daniel. You saved yourself. You just didn't know it." He smiled at that small, weary, but full of peace. When spring came again, the land came alive. Calves were born in the pastures, and the creek thawed, glittering beneath the sunlight. Lila began painting the old fence white, laughing when Daniel teased her about wasting paint on something the wind would soon chip away. "Maybe," she said, grinning, "but beauty don't need to last forever to matter." That became their unspoken truth. They both knew life was fragile, that sorrow could find them again someday, but neither lived in fear of it anymore. The pain of their pasts hadn't disappeared. It had simply softened, turned into something they carried together. One evening, as twilight spilled across the valley, Lila brought out her old shawl, the one she'd worn the day he found her in the snow. She laid it over the porch railing and said quietly, "I used to hate this thing. It reminded me of when I was a girl running from a world that didn't want her. But now, it reminds me of where I ended up." Daniel looked at her, his heart swelling with something wordless. "You ended up home," he said simply. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yeah, I did." They stood there for a long while, watching the sky turn silver as the first flakes of another winter began to fall. Lila reached out, took his hand, and held it tightly. "We may not have much, Daniel," she whispered, "but it's enough, isn't it?" He squeezed her hand, his voice rough with emotion. "More than enough." As snow began to gather on the porch rail, Daniel thought of the man he had been before that fateful day, the one who had given up on dreams, on love, on family. He realized that life had given him a second chance, not by giving him what he'd lost, but by giving him what he needed. And though he and Lila lived quietly, with no grand declarations, their hearts spoke the truth every day they shared, the truth that love, when born from kindness and endurance, doesn't fade with the years. It deepens. That night, as the fire crackled low and the storm whispered against the windows, Daniel looked across the small cabin at Lila, who sat sewing by the hearth. Her hair caught the firelight, her face soft and calm, and for the first time in decades, he felt entirely at peace. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the ranch in white silence. But inside that cabin, warmth endured, flickering, gentle, and eternal.